Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be covering how to fly a straight-in approach in Microsoft Flight Simulator in weather conditions that allow me to see where I'm going and where I want to land. The genesis of this episode is that someone called Tails the Fox commented on a previous video that I made saying that they were struggling to line themselves up with a runway for landing and getting themselves into the right position and the right altitude at the right time. My plan is to cover 3 different ways to approach and land under VFR conditions. In this video, I'm going to cover the straight-in approach. In a future video, I'll cover how to join and fly a traffic pattern. And finally, I'll cover in a last video a technique that I use when I need to improvise my landing. You can use the techniques I'm going to be explaining in this series for standalone flights that you create in Flight Sim, but these techniques come in pretty useful as well when you're doing landings in the bush trips. You're pretty much left to your own to find the airport as well as figuring out how to land in the bush trips, so I find these techniques come in pretty useful for that. The straight-in approach I'm going to show you in this video doesn't need a flight plan, although having one doesn't really hurt, but what you will need to do is a little bit of upfront research before you take off for your destination. Just like with the bush flights, I'm going to assume that you're not using any type of air traffic control, whether it's the built-in ATC or something like VATSIM, since in those cases you're going to have to follow what the controllers are telling you rather than figuring out how to land on your own. I'm also going to put a huge disclaimer that what I'm going to be showing you in this video and the future videos of this series is not necessarily representative of what you would do in real life. This is what works well for me in the sim and nothing more. With all of that said, let's start looking at the straight-in approach. I'm going to demo the straight-in approach with a short flight to the airport of Nantes, which is situated in western France. You'd think the straight-in approach would actually be one of the easiest ways to land since you just fly straight down to the runway, but I find it to be one of the hardest because you actually have to be a little bit clever to get yourself into the right position to be able to fly straight into the runway. Now, I tend to break down a VFR approach into 2 distinct phases. The first phase is the descent from cruise altitude all the way down to about 1,000 feet above the airport's altitude. The second phase of the approach is where you line yourself up with the runway and you descend from 1,000 feet above the airport's altitude all the way down to the ground. The first thing I do is get the runway headings for the airport that I'm looking to land at. I can get that just by clicking on the airport, and the runways are going to appear on the right-hand side right here. I can see that there's just a single runway at this airport, which is on heading 21 or 03, depending from which direction you're coming from. In my case, I'm going to be flying in from the northeast, so runway 21 is looking like a good candidate for my straight-in approach. Before I can confirm that runway 21 is going to work for me, I do need to make sure that the wind direction is going to line up for a landing on that runway. I can see that the wind is blowing from a heading of 247 at 4 knots, which means I'm going to have a very slight crosswind when I'm coming in to land if I'm landing on runway 21, but I think overall that'll work pretty well for my straight-in approach. If the wind was blowing from the opposite direction, let's say 060, in that situation, I probably wouldn't be able to use runway 21 because I'd be landing with the wind at my back, and you always want to be landing into the wind as much as possible. The next thing to take note of is the airport's altitude. Now, unfortunately, that isn't shown on the little information box that you get on the right-hand side here. So what you actually got to do is you got to set your airport as the arrival, and at that point, you're going to have a navlog button that's going to appear right here at the top. And when you click on it, you'll be able to see the airport's altitude. It's going to be your last waypoint in the navlog, and you're going to see what the altitude is in this fourth column right here. So this airport is at 100 feet, which means that I'm going to want to be at around 1,100 feet for my transition from my descent from cruise towards my final approach to the runway. The really tricky part of the straight-in approach, though, is knowing at which point over the ground you need to be that 1,000 feet above the airport's altitude. There is one little trick that you can use, which I've done right now in the game. So by selecting only the arrival airport, what it's done is it's added a custom waypoint, which is going to be exactly 3 nautical miles from the end of the runway. You'll notice that it's also set me to be 1,000 feet above the ground here, which is exactly what we're looking for. What the flight planning screen is doing here is it's using something called the rule of 3, which says that for every 3 nautical miles over the ground, we have 1,000 feet of altitude that we can descend. You can also estimate where 3 nautical miles would be if you want to use the legend at the bottom here. You can have a good indication of how far 1 nautical mile is, and you can figure out pretty easily where 3 nautical miles is going to be as well. Now, I'm actually pretty lucky that 3 nautical miles out from the end of this runway has a very clear visual landmark. You can see it's the western edge of this island here near the city of Nantes. In a situation where there isn't a clear landmark that you can use as your transition point towards the runway, you're probably going to want to use the traffic pattern to come into land rather than trying to fly straight in. I'll explain that in a future video. All right, with all of that information collected on my arrival airport, I'm pretty much ready to go flying. Before I do that though, I'm going to have to either select a departure airport or just clear the flight plan entirely if I want to fly without a flight plan, because otherwise I'm going to end up starting the flight midair. In my case, I'm just going to set my departure airport to be this little airport right here, and then I'm going to go fly that flight. Before I demonstrate the landing, I do want to remind you, if you get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit that like button. And if you're one of the majority of people who haven't chosen to subscribe yet, please consider doing so. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that I've got a flight plan loaded for this flight, but I'm going to ignore it for the most part. I'm going to be following visual landmarks the whole way to my destination. In this case, it's super easy because I just have to follow this river that's just to the left of me all the way to my destination city and airport. You can only fly like this if you've done your research ahead of time like I just did, and that's why I spent so much time in the flight planning section, because I wanted to know precisely where I need to be to align myself with the runway for that straight-in approach. That said, if I wanted to make my straight-in super easy, I could just follow the flight plan that was loaded up, because they've made some improvements in the flight planning engine, where now when you set a flight path from point A to point B, it's going to set it up so that you are not flying just a straight line to that other airport. It's going to line you up so that you're actually going to be configured in the right place to come in and land at the airport. I probably should have gone a step further in my case though, since I'm not going to be doing that by going into the FPL menu and then going in to delete the actual flight plan so that it's not showing on the multifunction display at all. I was flying along at a relatively low cruise altitude of about 2,000 feet. So getting down to 1,100 feet like I was explaining in the planning section is just going to take me a little bit over 2 minutes at 500 feet per minute. That's a very comfortable descent rate, and I don't have to really plan for it very much because I wasn't very high in the first place. I can just gauge how far I am from the city and start my descent approximately at the right time. If I did have to descend down from a higher altitude though, I would have to plan it out a little bit better, and specifically I'd have to figure out how far out I need to be before starting my descent. I've covered the details of how to calculate that in a previous video, so I won't cover it here, and I'll add a link to it in the show notes. Another thing to take note of is that if you are trying to fly this flight as realistically as possible, there are likely some other air restrictions that you would have to follow, especially when you're getting closer to the city and the airport. I'm going to ignore those for this video. I'm really just trying to demonstrate how to do the straight-in approach. Now, as I'm continuing to descend down to 1,100 feet, I'm keeping an eye out for that island that we identified in the flight planning section that's going to indicate that I'm getting close to the airport. I can just see it off to the left there, and it looks like it's the right one. There have been a few other ones along the way, but this looks to be right because I can actually see the city below me as well. I'm going to level off at 1,100 feet, which is the altitude that we saw in the planning section that we need to be 3 nautical miles from the airport. 1,100 feet is where you would do the traffic pattern for this airport, so it makes sense to hold that altitude until you're established on the final approach course. Once the airport does come into view, that's where I'm going to start maybe making some small adjustments to my alignment so that I can more easily get myself into the right position for that straight-in approach. I've already got my altitude right, and I've already configured the airplane for approach by setting the flaps to the approach position, and I've set my power correctly. So really it's just a matter of waiting for the airport's runway to be right off of my wing, at which point I'm going to be able to turn inbound towards it. You'll recall there's a little bit of a headwind at the moment because the wind is blowing from 240 or just about, so I can wait a long time before I turn in. All right, and just as I'm getting there, you can see that the island's western tip definitely lines up with the runway. So at this point, I'm going to turn inbound towards it, but I'm actually probably turning a little bit too steeply. You see, I'm gonna undershoot the turn here. So I'm just gonna shallow that up, and I'm going to wait for the runway to come back towards me. And I can also start to see the runway landing lights in the distance there, which is telling me that I'm a little bit too low. I've got 3 red and 1 white. All right, now I've got 2 red and 2 white, so at this point I can pull back on the throttle a little bit more to slow the airplane down and establish myself at around a 500 foot per minute descent. And I'm gonna try and maintain those 2 reds and those 2 whites all the way down to the runway. Other than that, the landing is pretty much a normal landing, which I've explained in previous videos as well. I'll link to all of those. There's a few videos where I cover different mistakes that you can make on landing, as well as covering the basics of how you actually have to come in and land at an airport. In this case though, the landing is going to be pretty smooth and I don't really expect any trouble from here on out. I'm really just flying that 3 nautical mile final like we saw, which respects the 3-to-1 rule that we were looking at in the flight planning section, and I just follow that descent rate all the way down to the runway. There really wasn't much to demonstrate in the actual flight portion of this video. It really is all about that planning section. But hopefully you still got some value out of this video, and if you did, I'll just remind you once again to make sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. If you have any comments or you want to critique something that I did, feel free to put it below. I'll see you in the next video.